I want to talk this morning about something that might actually be a little bit uncomfortable for you. If you grew up in churches, if you spend time in churches, the topic for this morning may be one that you struggle to articulate out loud and to say out loud, but my guess is on some level it's something that every person watching this video has struggled with at one time or another. Maybe now you're struggling with it. The conversation I want to have this morning is about doubt. That is a word that we struggle with mightily in the church world and in the Christian world. We're very uncomfortable with the concept of doubt at times. We often attach judgment to it. We feel like doubt is bad and having doubt is bad. We feel like it's a sign of weak faith or it's a sign that we're losing our faith. We can oftentimes believe if we question or doubt God at times, we don't want to entertain those thoughts because our fear is that's a sign of something bad happening. So we hide it because we don't want people to know that we're struggling with it. We don't want people to know that we have questions. We don't want people to know that sometimes we wonder how all this adds up or if it adds up. We really want to hide that fact from the people that we share a Christian walk with because of all the reasons I mentioned a minute ago. I want to start by letting you know that reaction of fear, that reaction of shame, is a very normal reaction. And I don't want you to feel bad about the fact that doubt makes you feel bad. Okay? I know that was a couple of different types of bad, but don't feel bad about the fact that doubt makes you feel bad. You may have struggled in the last few months as our culture has gone through something that none of us would have ever foreseen. You may have struggled with doubt in the past few months. How could God allow this? Whether it was the pandemic, whether it was the disease itself, whether it was the economic fallout from it, you may have struggled at some point over the last 3 months with the question, how could God do this? We are racked with confusion, and in that confusion, it can be easy to wonder whether God has taken his hand off the wheel or whether God's even there to begin with. I understand that, and when you encounter moments in life that you can't make sense of, when you encounter moments in life that are painful and that are confusing, doubt is to be expected. It's your brain trying to make sense of something that you can't make sense of. I'll recall, and it's not our text for today, but I'll recall for you the disciples in Mark's account, gospel account. We have the disciples in the boat with Jesus during the calming of the storm. Again, that's not our text for today, but in the middle of that storm, I've taught that class before, which come up a couple of times already. In the midst of that calming of the storm, they doubted. They went to Jesus, and the first question they had of him was, "Don't you care if we drown?" They had Jesus, the physical human Jesus, in the boat with them. They'd seen his miracles. They'd seen what he was capable of doing. And in the midst of confusion, in the midst of hurt, and in the midst of pain, they doubted. Doubt in the face of uncertainty is very normal. The thing is, churches traditionally and generally, not all of them, but generally don't do a great job of talking about doubt. The fact that sometimes we struggle with our belief. We talk about undying, complete faith and utter reliance on the sovereignty of God. And that's a great message. I'm not criticizing that message. It's a fantastic message. I've tried to say that as many times as possible in these videos. Relying on the sovereignty of God is paramount to a faithful walk. But plenty of people hear that message while they're internally struggling with doubt. And so what they hear when we say undying dedication and faith, and internally they're struggling with doubt, what they hear is, I shouldn't feel this way. Most Christians don't feel this way. This is bad. Something terrible or shameful is happening to me. And so I shouldn't say it out loud. And so many times, good, well-intentioned people, good, well-intentioned Christians, hide it. That hiding of doubt has consequences. It's a major theme of my teaching personally as we go through this series, but that doubt has consequences. So let's talk about what happens when that doubt festers. A couple of times in this series already, you've heard me make some kind of observation or comment about getting what's inside out, and that's how processing works. Even the ugly stuff, the scary stuff, the traumatic stuff, getting what's inside out is a part of the healing process. It's a major theme of my clinical work, and it's a major theme of what I try to bring to my ministry, is getting what's inside out. To be honest, to be transparent about what you're struggling with and what you're going through. There's something I try to encourage people when they walk in the door. I try to let them know that there's nothing that can't be worked through. We can work through anything that you're willing to be open about. The one thing that can't be worked through is the thing that you're unwilling to explore openly. Doubt about who God is or what he does is very hard to be open about, so it festers. But here's the thing. A lot of people decide that they've lost their faith, and I put that in quotes because they never really processed their doubt. They never really out loud articulated what they were struggling with, and so they went through this process internally where it felt as though that's what was happening, is they were losing their faith. Whereas had they been willing to get that doubt out and to explore it and to discuss it openly, it's possible the end result would have been something different than just lost faith. They let it fester inside like a disease. They saw signs that it was there, but they ignored it. They felt things that no one could see, but they didn't say it out loud because they didn't want people around them to worry or to panic like a disease. They noticed symptoms before anybody else, but they didn't want to tell anybody because they didn't want anybody to worry about them. They didn't want to hear it from their parents, or they didn't want to hear it from their spouse about all the ways in which their struggle and their doubt were horrifying and scary. And so they just kind of kept it inside. And when that happens, that doubt metastasizes into a full-blown crisis of faith. And I think for a lot of people who believe that they've lost their faith, that's what happened. You had a seed of doubt, and rather than process it out loud and discuss it openly, you let it fester, and it became way bigger than it had to be. For many of those people, there are some fundamental truths about doubt that can make a huge difference. And this morning, we're going to focus on one of those. Now, we could do an entire series on doubt, and you know what? Maybe we will at some point. But for now, we want to focus on just some basic elements of doubt. There's one thing that I want to make sure that you hear. Faith and doubt are not mutually exclusive. Having faith does not mean that you never doubt, and it doesn't mean you don't struggle with doubt, and it doesn't mean that doubt can't be a part of your walk from time to time, and it can't be something that you wrestle with. And having doubt doesn't mean you don't have faith, and it doesn't mean that you can't be a faithful Christian. It's important to separate those two terms because I think sometimes internally we decide that they can't coexist. But we want to be open about that doubt because the more we look at doubt, the more we find ways to minimize it and ways to process it. The more we look at what Jesus does with doubt, the more we learn about what to do with ours. So this morning, we're going to take a look at sincere doubt and how Jesus handled it in the life of a man that, I really relate to. Let's get into the text for this morning. In Mark chapter 9, there's a brief little encounter that Jesus has with a father and son. It takes place just after the transfiguration and begins in verse 14. The passage is going to be in Mark chapter 9, verses 14 through 29. If you want to pause now and go ahead and read that will give you some context for what we're about to explore. But if not, I'm going to tell you the story now. This face-to-face encounter involves the father of a young boy. Like the story of Legion, this boy is possessed by a demon. Just after Jesus has come down off the mountain, he encounters this father. This father desperately wants his son to be healed of the demon that possesses him. If we'll let it, the Bible speaks to us on such a personal level. And if we read it that way, you'd be amazed at how many times you'll find your family in scriptures. Last week, the video from last week, I talked about my family history. This story speaks to me very, very personally as well. I rediscovered this story a few years ago at a moment where I struggled to understand God's plan and I wrestled with doubt of my own. I won't share the extended version of this story in video form. Those of you who've been in sermons with me or been in classes with me have heard the long form version of this story. But the short version is my youngest son had just been diagnosed with a very rare form of epilepsy when I re-encountered this story. He was having focal seizures and we had been in and out of hospitals, and he had extended stays just to get the diagnosis. In the midst of that struggle, in the midst of being a father of a son who was struggling with seizures that I couldn't stop and I couldn't fix, I rediscovered this passage. And in verse 15 of Matthew's account, so in Matthew 17, this same story appears. And in verse 15 of that account reads like a punch in the stomach to parents who've been through things like what my family and I experienced. The father in this story looks at Jesus and he says something heartbreaking. He says, "Lord, have mercy on my son, for he has seizures and he suffers terribly." I have said those words verbatim. And when I read them, it affected me. When I saw it in the Word, it affected me greatly. I relate to this dad. I know what his heart was feeling in that moment. He just wants his son not to suffer. You may relate to the seizures. You may relate to being a father or a mother who just desperately wants to fix what's wrong with your child. But even if you can't relate to what this father is going through as a father, I'm sure you can relate to his pain. But even if you don't yet, I think you're about to. He tells Jesus that he brought his son to his disciples and his disciples couldn't heal him. Then he says something that again breaks my heart because of the deep sincerity behind it. This father who just wants his son to be healed looks at Jesus and he says, "If you can, please heal him." Jesus looks at him and says, "If you can, all things are possible if you believe." So there it is. Jesus looks this dad straight in the eye and says, "If you believe I can, your son will be healed." Again, if you've ever been a parent who just wants your son to feel better or wants a child to be healed, anything. Tell me anything and I'll do it. I believe that's what this father was feeling in this moment. And his response is absolutely heartbreaking, but it's so intensely honest. And it is what I want us to focus on the most this morning. In this moment of desperation, this father has sought out Jesus to heal his son. Jesus looks at the father and says, "If you believe, your son will be healed." His words that come next are our words and our most desperate moments of doubt. And they're the words that I want you to hear this morning. His words are our words when we doubt, but we really don't want to doubt. It's there, but we really don't want it there. I'm going to read in verse 24. Immediately the father of the child cried out and said, "I believe. Help me in my unbelief." He leads with the conviction that I know he wants to have in this moment. I believe. There's conviction in those first two words. And then I imagine there was a pause. And then there was truth. Help me with my unbelief. So how does Jesus respond to this dad? Does he rebuke him? Does he cast him out? Does he leave him to his own devices and talk about what a terrible Christian he is and how he doesn't believe in Jesus and so he doesn't deserve to get the healing that he wants? Of course not, because that's not how Jesus handles us. In the face of honest doubt, Jesus responds with compassion. He rebukes not the dad, but the demon. He demands the demon leave the boy. It does, and it leaves the boy laying on the ground. This father gets the healing that he asked for. The people standing there think the boy is dead because of the dramatic way in which this had taken place. The boy's laying there lifeless on the ground. And then Jesus does what Jesus always does in moments like this, where he tenderly takes the boy's hand and lifts him up. This father showed doubt. Jesus doesn't cast him aside. He compassionately gives him exactly what he needs. But the father did something that I think is really important for us to take in mind. He confessed his doubt directly to Jesus, and he did it in the context of begging for help. During the earliest stages of my son's diagnosis, I guess, I prayed every day that God would simply take it all away. That was a part of our prayers and elders meetings. It was a part of our prayer and staff meetings. Every single time we prayed, just take it all away. And in those moments, I remembered this father's plea. During the past few months, many of you listening to this video have struggled with doubt. Does God care? Is he really in control? Is he even real? Struggle can cause us to question everything in search of some kind of an answer. That's what our brains do. We want to know who or what to blame so we can decide in the midst of our darkest hours, God must have either done it or he's not there at all. That's just the way our brains operate. Doubt is a normal part of our life. God understands it, and he can absolutely handle your questions. But in the midst of your heaviest moments of doubt, remember the words of this dad who just wanted to help his son. I believe. Help me in my unbelief. If you're struggling with doubt this morning, if you're struggling with doubt in the midst of this pandemic, I want you to remember those words. And I want them to be an actual, tangible, functional part of your prayer life. I believe. Help me with my unbelief. I believe we're given those words for a reason. The story's not quite over, though. The story ends with the disciples asking Jesus why they couldn't cast the demon out. And Jesus' answer is incredibly simple. He tells the disciples, this kind can only be cast out through prayer. In other words, you weren't praying. You were trying to do it on your own. Alone, you can't control this demon. But when you pray, God can. Alone, you can't control the demon of doubt. But when you pray, God can. I believe. Help me in my unbelief. Every time you struggle with the demon of doubt, in the face of a personal crisis, in the face of a family crisis, a social, a political crisis, a pandemic, an economic collapse, a war, a person you respect deciding that God isn't real and then doing it publicly on social media so people can see it. Anytime you're confronted with a moment of doubt, this kind can only be driven out through prayer. And God gave us a script for how that prayer should sound. I believe. Help me in my unbelief. Hear those words this morning. Apply them to your own doubt. Use them in your prayer life. And I think you will be amazed at what God can do with your honesty.